Hi, welcome. Um, Welcome to the first evening of the Architectural League series, The Housing System. I'm Rosalie Ginevra, the Executive Director of the League, and I'm very happy to be here to launch this series, which we hope will stimulate some fresh thinking about one of our cities and our country's most challenging issues, the inadequacy and bad fit of our housing supply to the size and contours of our collective need for shelter. We have shaped the programs in the series around some cross-cutting questions in the hope that the presentations and discussions of the next several weeks will generate new perspectives on the nature and interrelationships of different elements of the overall housing system. The series is not structured to be about affordable housing or about homelessness or public housing or the luxury market or middle-class homeowners, nor is it about specific design strategies or financing or policy innovations, though it will touch on all those things. It's called the housing system to emphasize the point of view that the ways that we finance, design, develop, maintain, and inhabit housing for all income levels are interconnected, dynamic, and mutually affecting. The series is focused on the material reality of housing, not because we are not interested in broad questions of strategy and policy and use, but because we think that the material reality so directly reflects the values that drive the housing system and the value that we assign to our housing. We're not aiming for comprehensiveness, either in each individual program or in the series as a whole, which in any case would be impossible on this complicated topic. We do hope that you'll be provoked to see things in some new ways. We've structured the first 3 nights of the series around some ingrained attitudes and some eagerly accepted or eagerly recently adopted ideas that we think should be examined critically, and the 4th and 5th nights around some promising new approaches to zoning and new technologies. And the last program, which please note is at 4 p.m., an odd time, I know, but there's a reason for it, 4 p.m. on June 10th, on learning about possibilities for systemic change from another complicated social construct, the healthcare system. Each of the programs has a different format in terms of presenters and respondents and interlocutors, and we hope you'll come to as many as you can. I call your attention to the reading list noted in your program and to the other work the Architectural League has done on housing in recent years, which with links also noted in the program. And a huge acknowledgement and thank you to Emily Schmidt, the League's Manager of Housing Initiatives, for her work shaping this series, and to the whole League staff for helping make these events happen. Tonight's program is about our existing housing stock and what it requires from us. Especially from the architectural perspective, when we think housing, we very often think new or newly renovated. Tonight's program is about the need to reconsider and reframe that thinking. Consider, for example, that New York City has 3,469,240 housing units, and that in 2017, building permits were issued for 22,131 units of housing. At this rate, it would take us 157 years to build our current inventory. So we need to make sure that we hold on to and can keep using what we have. What does it take to make sure that we do that when we also need to radically reduce the energy consumption of buildings? Who does the work of maintaining and stewarding what we have, and what can architects contribute to this work? We have 4 extremely interesting people tonight to help us think about the answers to these questions. You have biographies in your program, so I'll just say that Shannon Mattern, who will give a short introduction and then moderate the discussion, is, in addition to being a professor at the New School, is a columnist for Places Journal, where her writing includes the piece Maintenance and Care, a working guide to the repair of rust, dust, cracks, and corrupted code in our cities, our homes, and our social relations, which is part of the inspiration for tonight's session. Shannon's introduction will be followed by presentations by architect Laurie Kerr, building superintendent Jennifer Davis, and architect Mitch McEwen, and then all of them will come together on the stage for discussion with time for some questions from all of you. So please join me in welcoming Shannon Mattern.
much. Thank you for having me. Thanks for coming. And I think my introduction might repeat a little bit of what Rosalie said, but I think some of these themes maybe bear repetition. So if we were to ask a housing scholar, developer, policymaker, activist, or designer about the most pressing issues in the field, they'd probably mention mortgages, interest rates, affordability, gentrification, homelessness, energy efficiency, the fate of single-family zoning, millennials' ability to take up the American mantle of homeownership. Maybe they'd mention amenity creep in luxury high-rises and planned communities, and the infusion of technology into all facets of the field, from real estate to surveillance to the smart home. Here in New York and in many urban areas, a housing discussion is also likely to elicit laments over the state of public housing. Mold, no heat, lead paint, and the assignment of responsibility for its state of repair or disrepair. It's also telling that de Blasio appointed Catherine Garcia, that is, the city's sanitation commissioner, to temporarily run the housing authority. So here we already have the merger of maintenance and housing. The Architecture League's new series on the housing system will address such issues as the housing typologies, including small dwellings and collective housing, policy and regulation, methods of production, and possibilities for systemic change. It might seem a bit odd to kick off this series with a discussion of maintenance and operations, which tend to become relevant after a building has already been funded, designed in accordance with particular typologies, shaped by regulations and policies, and constructed. But tonight we want to consider what it might mean to think about operations and upkeep, repair and care, as more than just functional concerns that become relevant after the architects leave the building. Housing has long been expressly designed to facilitate and often obfuscate particular acts of maintenance, the ejection of trash, the disposal of human waste, the work of domestic staff from scullery maids to building superintendents. And as we recognize the wider social, cultural, ethical, economic, and environmental implications of housing, as we acknowledge that houses are just as much for communities, societies, and ecological legacies as they are for individual people and families, we should also concede that housing maintenance is about much more than fixing boilers and unclogging drains. And apparently we have a case study upstairs with the toilets in the women's restroom right now. So housing maintenance has repercussions for public health and for the strength of both social and environmental ecologies. As Karen Kuby notes in her recently published edited collection, which was celebrated here at the League last year, housing and its maintenance constitute an intervention towards social equity. Lucky for us, there's a big cross-disciplinary discussion about maintenance and care taking place right now. Of course, preservationists, conservationists, information workers like librarians and archivists, maintenance workers themselves, Marxist feminists, and people who study or develop policy about domestic labor and care have long been thinking about these issues. But the sphere of concerned actors has grown dramatically, partly in response to the ubiquitous fetishization of innovation. It turns out that moving fast and breaking stuff not only doesn't make things better, but it actually results in a lot of broken stuff. Broken gadgets, broken friendships, broken democracies. We get digital personal assistants that listen in on our every conversation, Nest cams that allow creepy hackers to talk to your children through baby monitors, smart cities that are actually pretty dumb ideas. Several years ago, communication scholar Stephen Jackson proposed that we take erosion, breakdown, and decay rather than novelty, growth, and progress as our starting points. His broken world thinking calls for an appreciation of the ongoing activities by which stability is maintained. In many academic disciplines and professional practices, architecture, urban studies, labor history, development economics, and the information sciences, to name just a few, maintenance has taken on a new resonance as a theoretical framework, an ethos, a methodology, and a political cause. This is an exciting area of inquiry precisely because the lines between professional and creative practice, policy, and scholarship are blurred. In 2016, the historians of technology, Andrew Russell and Lee Vinsel, roused a research network called the Maintainers. They held 2 celebrated conferences and published calls to action in national venues, which in turn inspired dozens of journal articles, conference panels, exhibitions, dissertations, workshops, and creative projects. For nearly 20 years, I've been writing about the care work that takes place in social infrastructures like libraries and hardware stores. And last summer, I was invited by my editors at Places Journal to write a broad survey of maintenance work across scales of operation. So in maintenance and care, I looked to civil engineering, official and informal urban infrastructures, architectural preservation, building maintenance, domestic labor, and the feminist and post-colonial politics of care, gadget repair, and the cleaning and curation of code, which is a resource that fuels the operation of our digital objects, our networked architectures, and our intelligent urban systems. I'm pretty sure this article, as Rosalie just confirmed, was one of the primary reasons I was invited here tonight. It's also why I'm now serving on the steering committee for the Maintainers 3, which will take place in early October in DC. We're aiming to gather practitioners, artists, designers, scholars, and policymakers from a variety of fields. I encourage all of you to take a look at the website and propose a presentation, a panel, or a workshop. So this evening, I imagine we'll take a cross-scalar look at maintenance, too. We'll acknowledge that repairing, say, a thermostat, has implications for building-wide maintenance, which itself impacts the state of repair of the housing system at large, which in turn says a lot about what and who our city and society value, both today and for the future. And with that, I'll turn it over to our first presenter.
Hello, I'm Laurie Kerr, and I'm an architect, and I've been working in green building policy, mostly here in New York, but in other cities around the country. So tonight I'm going to talk about steam heat and climate change. So starting at the macro level here in New York, about 3 years ago, New York City signed on to the goal of reducing its carbon emissions by 80% by 2050. How do you do that? Well, the first thing is you have to know where your carbon emissions are coming from. And in New York, 70% of the carbon emissions come from energy used in buildings. Why is this? Well, the rest of the country is pretty much transportation dominated. Here we use public transportation or walk. So there's not that much from transportation, not that much, you won't find this surprising, from agriculture or industry. So what's left is the buildings. And, you know, just look out the window and it's obvious that it would be the buildings. But it's not just the buildings. If you really look at our growth rates, you come to realize that by 2050, approximately 80% of the buildings that we're going to have then are buildings we have today. So that focuses the mind. It's really the existing buildings that are the big nut to crack in terms of taming New York City's carbon emissions. And it's a difficult nut because energy codes are almost always really designed around new buildings. They're really, when we started down this road over 10 years ago, there really were no models for addressing existing buildings in terms of their energy use anywhere in the world. So one of the things that made it easier in New York is that the large buildings in New York dominate. So we actually have 1 million buildings in New York, but just 2% of them, the buildings that are over 50,000 square feet, so that'd be about a 50-unit apartment building, those buildings account for half the square footage and half the energy use. So those buildings have relatively sophisticated organizational structures in place and can kind of take this on. So when we looked at making policies, we said, let's start with that half. Rather than dealing with 1 million buildings, let's start with 20,000, which is half the square footage of the city. So in 2009, New York City passed the Greener, Greater Buildings Plan. And it was really the first comprehensive set of policies in the world to address energy use in existing buildings. And the sort of cornerstone policy of that was that it required buildings to actually measure their energy use every year, and that energy information is public. You can go on the web and see it for every one of these buildings. You want to know what the Dakota uses? You want to know the Museum of Modern Art? You can look them up. And Seagram's building, for example, has a out of 100, from 1 to 100 Energy Star score, 1 being very poor. Seagram's building has a score of 3. So you can look that up and see how your buildings are doing, and that's obviously foundational. You're not going to be able to improve these buildings unless you know how well they're doing to begin with. So along with that, the Greener Greater Buildings Plan required the large buildings to do audits every 10 years, something called retro-commissioning. It's basically a tune-up. So there are really 2 tools to fix energy use in buildings. One is to say, oh, these are the systems that we have. They're not working quite right. Let's tune them up and get them working well. Another lens, which is also valuable, is we have these antiquated technologies. Let's replace them with more modern ones. And really, making a building function better involves some of each. Some is fixing what you have, some is replacing with newer, better technologies. So that every large building is required to do both of those every 10 years in New York now. Also, it required lighting upgrades and sub-metering of commercial tenants. Those policies are now being replicated in 35 cities in America, from Los Angeles to Chicago to Atlanta. So they've been pretty influential. Some years later, obviously it's time to move forward. Those are foundational policies, but to hit these ambitious goals, we have to do a lot more. So in 2016, the city expanded to buildings between 25,000 and 50,000 square feet, now capturing about 60% of the built area of the city. And in 2017, it passed an ordinance that will require energy grades to be posted in the lobbies of buildings. I think this was because, even though it's nice to have it on the web, it still hasn't created a public discussion because it's not visible like the restaurant grades are. So visibility, super important. I think that will start rolling out in 2020. I've used the restaurant grades here. That's not what the building grades are going to look like. It's just to give you an idea. It's another one of these transparency policies, right? The idea that if people know the calories in the food, if people understand the efficiency of the building, they're going to act differently. They're going to ask for better. So measuring and making visible, were sort of primary first wave policies in addressing why energy use at the large scale in New York. Now, just 2 weeks ago, you've probably heard that New York City passed a very, very ambitious law. It's been called Intro 1253. I don't know what the number of it is, but it's really groundbreaking. It places a carbon per square foot cap on every one of these buildings as per building type. So residential buildings have a cap, commercial office buildings have a cap, and so on. There are about 8 or 9 different categories. Rent-regulated multifamily buildings have a stringent list of actions rather than a cap, and that was to avoid triggering what's called the major capital improvement, where the building owner will charge the tenant for improvements that they make. So they didn't want to trigger that at the large scale in New York. So the actions that are required won't trigger that. There are a couple of other options for buildings to comply. One is purchasing green power. Another is a trading scheme like emissions trading, which worked for which worked for nitrous oxides and other pollutants. So we're thinking that that could work here as well. So if buildings don't comply, there are actually quite stringent fines that start coming due in 2024 and 2030, depending on how seriously off the cap the building is. What is this going to mean for architects? I think it's going to mean quite a lot of work in terms of insulating roofs, better windows, more efficient lighting systems, and so forth. But it also, in the existing buildings, but I think it's also going to impact new construction in ways that people haven't maybe quite caught up to, because a building that you're building now will be an existing building in 2030 when the most stringent caps kick in. So building owners, developers are going to be very serious about what they're building, because they're not going to want to build something that's going to accrue fines or need to be renovated between now and 2030. So I think this is a game changer for new buildings as well as existing. So how will buildings, especially multifamily buildings, comply? Well, we know a lot, because the ordinances that we passed, the benchmarking ordinance and the audit ordinance, yielded an enormous amount of data. We decided not to just do audits, but that we would collect the information from the audits electronically. It would be organized, and it would tell us all about, you know, which buildings have steam heat, how many have window air conditioners. All of that has been collected, and we have now information on all of these large buildings. So here's a snapshot of how buildings use energy in New York. And you can see the multifamily housing sector among the large buildings is by far and away the biggest energy user. And within that sector, space heating really dominates. So heating is the largest user of energy in the city, and it's about 50% of the energy use, more than 50% in multifamily buildings on average. So what do we know about the systems used in New York City buildings? Well, from that same cache of data, we have found out that 70% of New York City's buildings are heated with steam. And that is not just in the multifamily sector. You know, you think of these shiny new office buildings, they're going to have all wonderful new systems, but in fact, we've got a lot of Class B and Class C office buildings, and even within that building set, about half of it's heated with steam heat. So what is steam heat? Well, you have a boiler, and you have some pipes, and those pipes go up to radiators, and the steam fills the radiators. And in some cases, this shows a one-pipe system, one pipe coming up to the radiator, and the water that condenses flows right down that pipe. You could have two pipes where that water goes back. But this is, it's a very simple system, no moving parts. And maybe that's been one reason for its longevity. It's actually an 18th century invention. So here we are in the 21st century. And one thing I was delighted to learn is that it was more or less brought about by James Watt, who invented that steam engine. So he must have had a lot of steam lying around to use. And so he makes this copper radiator that uses steam heat. So what's the problem with steam heat? I think we're all familiar with this. It's uncontrollable. It's too hot or too cold. The only way to really control it, you've got to open the windows, which is obviously very inefficient and wasteful for energy. It also unbalances the building and makes all the problems worse. You've got your hissing and banging pipes. And, you know, you don't only think they're inefficient, they are inefficient. People who are analyzing it think that combined with leaky window air conditioning units, about half of a building's energy might be heating energy might be wasted, and water usage also is increased. How big is this problem? About 20% of New York City's carbon emissions come from steam heat. That's equal to all of the transportation in the city. I'm going to just say that one more time, or pause on that. I mean, we only think about transportation when we think about carbon emissions, but this piece of our building sector, steam heat, is actually equal to that in New York. But it doesn't have to be like this. We could do a lot. So it turns out that if you right-sized boilers, put in better controls, insulated steam pipes, balance the system, added controls to radiators, you could reduce the energy use in these steam systems by 20 to 25%. And it's actually very cost effective. And you could double that if you solved the leaky windows and ACs. And there are other techniques to replace steam systems with hot water ones. And then, of course, we want to get rid of fossil fuel altogether, so if you went even further and replaced these systems with ones that run on electricity, but this is much more expensive than the solutions I've been discussing, then you could do even better. But it's really important, not just in New York, to think about this, because New York isn't the only place that has a lot of steam heat. It really is used, it's used in the older, colder parts of America, really from the New England and the Mid-Atlantic all the way through the northern Midwest. It's such a big area, we've called it the Steam Belt. And it's about 140 million people, 40% of the country lives in, doesn't necessarily all have steam heat, but lives in areas where steam heat is pretty common. So, you know, in terms of addressing global warming and the existing building stock, addressing steam heat is going to be a big piece of it. And then I'm going to introduce Jenny Davis, who's the super in our building, and she's going to talk to you about a lot of things she did, but also we did address our steam system there. So.
Oh, sorry. Hi, so thanks for inviting me to be part of this panel. Laurie and I should have coordinated because you're going to hear a lot of things that you just heard, but I'll try to change it up a little bit. This is the wrong slide to start with. Hang on one second. How do I go? Here we go. Okay, so I have never done a PowerPoint before, so just bear with me. This may take a second for me to get my bearings. So I have been in building maintenance professionally for 22 years. I've always liked puzzles and tinkering with broken things and figuring out how they work, fixing them if they don't, and saving parts for something else if I need them. In the mid-1980s, when I started out on my own, I lived in a lot of subpar housing and learned how to fix many things in a desire to make a crumbling structure a home. I got good enough that more than once, landlords saw the value of what I did and raised the rent so much that I had to move. So at the time, I could feel the injustice of it, but I didn't know you could fight it. I also didn't know that it would inform the way my life choices, and certainly I never imagined that it would lead me here to addressing you this evening. So the program tonight is called The State of Good Repair, part of the series called The Housing System. I'm a resident manager, which is a fancy term for building superintendent, and I'm asked to speak on maintenance and operations. In this industry, a building in which people live is called housing, hence the housing system. However, in thinking about how I keep a building in good repair, I realized that my approach to maintenance is to provide not just housing, but homing, which to me, housing is a physical structure, and that is maintained with task-oriented maintenance, and it provides two things, housing and, let me step back 1 second. It provides two things, safety, which is maintenance-oriented, and comfort, which is holistic maintenance and can be achieved most easily with resident participation. So I'm going to explain that a little bit, and I'm also going to show how an energy audit can facilitate achieving not only energy savings, but comfort as well. All right, so I would like to explain what holistic maintenance means to me, but to do that I need to give you a bit of my background first. Sorry. Okay, I'm good, thanks. When I started at the Brookhouse Condominiums in Brookline, Massachusetts, 700 units, 5 buildings. They built in the late 1960s. This is where I learned the basics of maintenance, the simple necessary tasks specific to people's living spaces, fixing toilets, patching holes in walls, replacing broken switches. The men who were my coworkers were gracious and generous enough to share their knowledge with me, and in learning to address these isolated individual issues was necessary before I could move on to learning how the pieces fit together into larger systems, which is precisely what I did at my next position at the other building, which is the Reed House Condominiums. That's in Tribeca. It's about 86 apartments, and it was built in the 1980s. Here I learned about systems. This was tinkering, but on a much larger scale. It was holistic tinkering. And again, so much of this systemic knowledge was shared by contractors working in the building. I find that most people love to talk about their work. You just need to show an interest in what they're doing. So I had to take the small maintenance tasks, which are isolated things like fixing a toilet, and learn how they interacted with the systems to which they were attached, and diagnose how and where they were malfunctioning. Something as simple as one valve malfunctioning can interrupt water distribution for an entire building. So after 6 years, I felt I needed some new challenges, and that is when I moved on to my current building, Greenwich Tower. So Greenwich Tower is in Greenwich Village. It's 159 units. I've been there for 13 years. It is 2 old warehouses. One was built in 1898 and one was built in 1901. They were joined into one building in 1973 by Henry Mandel. Those of you who are into architecture might know that he's the son of, or Henry Mandel II might know that he's the son of Henry Mandel, the builder of London Terrace and the Brooklyn Navy Yards. They were converted into apartments in 1976 and became a co-op in 1990. So, being an older building, I was soon to discover that although it has great bones, it had many issues that needed attention. It needed not only a horde of small internal repairs, but holistic attention as well. So, by holistic maintenance, I mean looking at all the systems, seeing how they make sure they are functioning as intended, looking at how they interact with other systems, and how all those interactions may have gotten interrupted over the years. So now I'd like to share an example of an holistic approach to maintenance, and I call it the Heating Saga. So some of this you may have heard already from Laurie, but I'll try to go through it quickly. And I'll also try to show how the small maintenance items can impact the system and how the multiple systems can impact each other. So Greenwich Tower is heated by steam. Steam heating is the perfect example of why a holistic approach to maintenance and operations is necessary. Heating issues are generally reported on an individual basis. One apartment's too cold, one apartment's too hot. But steam is one singular entity, and it is ever and always only 212 degrees Fahrenheit. You cannot alter that. You can't change it to 60 or 80. It's always 212 degrees. So the building must be heated enough to make the coldest apartment comfortable, which means other people are going to be hot. In an unbalanced, steam is an excellent and efficient heat source, I think, if it's balanced. But it has to be carefully balanced, and that balance has to be constantly maintained. Remember, even one malfunctioning valve can throw off an entire system. Balancing steam is not difficult, but it does take knowledge and desire and attention and patience and constant tinkering. Most supers may not have the knowledge or the time or the patience to balance the system and will crank the heat and walk away, which is why you see windows open in the winter. This, of course, is inefficient and wasteful. My first winter was a lot of work. I had to figure out how to balance the couple of things you can that are on the boiler. It's not really that interesting, and I won't delve into the specifics, but once I finally got that to where it needed to be, then I had to begin addressing individual complaints. What I discovered was that I had to master not just the variables of the heating system, but also how that system interacted with other building systems. Why were some residents freezing while others still had their windows open? Turned out that most of the issues of underheating had nothing to do with the actual heating system. Sure, there were a few things that were easily maintained, minor issues, incorrectly sized air vents. These are what Laurie went through already. There could be broken air vents or broken radiator valves. Sometimes there was just a missing radiator. Someone got so hot in their apartment, they just took the radiator out altogether, or took it out and replaced it with an undersized radiator. So those are some of the issues that were small and easily maintained. And when we took care of those, we then found we had a myriad of unrelated issues that were parts of other systems. It could be air conditioners that weren't covered in the winter, or were installed incorrectly, or windows that were broken and didn't close all the way, or large pieces of furniture directly in front of the radiator so the heat couldn't move, or decorative radiator covers, or even so much as the color of the paint affects how much heat comes off of the radiator. That's why so many of them are painted silver, because that lets out the most heat. So after we did all these little things, we still had some issues, so we had to move on to looking at the entire heating system. The northwest corner of the building was still underheated. It gets wind off the Hudson, it gets no sun, and it is the farthest away from the boiler. So we had to look back at the heating system holistically. And so these are some of the things we did with that. We put more air vents on the large mains in the basement. We put vents on the risers that bring the steam up to the radiators. We insulated and repitched pipes. Now, after that, we still were pretty good, but we had some overheated apartments, so we added TRVs, which is a thermostatic radiator valve. It's a little control mechanism you can put on the radiator itself, which kind of works. We put those in apartments that we couldn't change the system in. So, for instance, apartments that get a lot of sun, or that are too close to the boiler room, or just sometimes the resident's disposition. We did a lot of these. However, the saga does continue. We'll next be adding insulation to a number of components in the boiler room, which should save some more fuel costs and make the apartment above the boiler room comfortable. Right now it's 80 degrees at all times, and even in the summer when he's blasting 2 air conditioners, it's still 80 degrees, so that should help him some. I would also like to point out that holistic maintenance works best when it's community-based. It's important to have resident involvement to create a safe and comfortable home. By actively listening to residents and addressing their concerns, they become part of the solution and invested in the outcome, especially when they see how it impacts not only energy conservation and therefore savings, but also their level of comfort in their home. So I want to now address briefly holistic maintenance on an even larger scale, and that is the energy audit. So an energy audit takes every aspect of the entire building. It looks at everything, its livability, its existing state, its systems, how they function. It looks at all of these under a microscope, and it also takes how the functioning of one specific building impacts the global environmental system. Laurie, that's what Laurie was talking about. So the audit process for me wasn't a big deal. It was a lot of opening doors, answering questions, getting some paperwork together. I think the property manager had to give the auditors a bunch of bills so they could crunch numbers. So after they gather this information and they process and process and process, they eventually come back and they give you a list of what areas they feel could be altered, repaired, replaced, or tweaked, and with an estimate of the time of implementation and the projected cost and, of course, the return on investment. And our buildings board opted to implement almost all of the items on their list. So some of the things that we did, the small, easy changes were insulating the return pipes in the basement and some of the distribution pipes that weren't insulated. We added a cool roof coating, which is white paint that is put over the asphalt roof. And we changed out all the washers and dryers for high efficiency machines. The big changes we did were replacing all of the T12 fluorescent stairwell and laundry room lights with bi-level T8 fluorescent fixtures. They also work as emergency lighting, so they will come on in an emergency, so we got 2 for 1 there. And replacing the single pane double hung windows with double pane argon filled low E coated casement windows. So by doing all this, we brought our energy usage down 45%. You can see this is a chart from Metered New York, Urban Green's website, which Laurie was talking about. So we lowered our greenhouse gas emissions from 7 kilograms per square foot yearly in 2010 to 3.8 kilograms in 2016. And you can see here from this chart that we are now in the lowest quarter of energy usage for buildings our size. We've already met the mandated reduction for 2030, called for the new emissions laws. And, you know, if I had more time and was a little bit better at this, I could probably talk to you about how some simple things can have a great impact. For instance, painting the, hang on 1 second. Painting the stairwell walls a bright white brightened the stairwells enough to allow us to safely use the bi-level lighting, or how replacing broken valves and missing aerators on faucets saved enough water to lower our bill, even though the price of water increased 14% the year that we did that, or how cleaning the dryer ducts twice a year lowers energy consumption. There are many simple ways that one system or easily altered item can greatly impact other things for worse or for better. It simply takes someone to notice and care enough to do it. And one last thing I'd like to touch on, which was mentioned in the conference call we had prior to this discussion, is whether we should be championing maintaining old stock over new and ideas of innovative maintenance. So none of the small maintenance tasks I've mentioned are difficult. I personally have hired and trained a number of young people who've gone on to careers in the field. I'd love to see a program where older buildings, those which have good bones and are still sturdy and safe, rather than being razed, be used as training grounds for building construction trades, as well as trained maintenance workforce, something between Habitat for Humanity and a union training program. This would create jobs for the teachers, and the trainees could be either paid or work on a work-to-own basis for a unit in the building in which they work. This, I believe, could foster a sense of community, a willingness to maintain the building in good repair, and it could provide job training, housing for those lacking, and most importantly, a safe and comfortable home. Thank you so much for your time. If you'd like any information on balancing a steam system, let me know. I have plenty of it.
Okay. Well, I could have listened to the balancing the steam system combined with the workforce housing model for like another hour or so. That was, you know, I feel like it's kind of surprisingly rare to come to an architecture event and really learn something, you know. So I feel like this is going to be such a letdown now because I don't know if I'm going to share anything practical or useful in my 15 minutes. But I will try to just give you a sense of the work that I've been doing in Detroit and just what I'm thinking about and what that might point towards. But just a warning that I think the only thing useful that you might learn, you've already learned. So renovating crisis, I'm kind of approaching the kind of question of the housing system in the sense that, it's sort of always already in crisis. And I'm going to talk about that specifically. I'm going to sort of share pieces of a text that I've written in relationship to a book that Kayunga Yamada-Taylor is writing, that I've sort of been in dialogue with her next book. But this is really, I'm kind of positioning this talk also to kind of question renovation as, an architectural system in relationship to the existing, and really sort of questioning, is there an alternative? And in that way, I think the housing system, it's sort of always racist in this country. It's sort of always sprawling. It's always this ecological disaster. It kind of fails to house everyone. But I want to situate that question spatially, not just at the kind of scales that we usually stage those questions when we talk about policy in terms of regions and urbanism. So to kind of jump into it, and I'm always thinking this through Lefebvre, this kind of notion that once we're dealing with space, that can kind of move through the space of policy as well as the space of a physical house. So I want to shift the notion of crisis that we're so ready to associate with late 20th century urbanism, let's say, the inner city, that obsolescent notion depending on your geography and Black neighborhoods, rather than locating crisis at the scale of the neighborhood or city, considering crisis at the scale of the building, and specifically the house. And this is where reading Kayunga Yamada-Taylor's Race for Profit, Black Home Ownership and the End of the Crisis, leads me to thinking of renovation as a mode of organicism that naturalizes relationships of power. And so, of course, one of the major relationships of power is the economy and sort of the market. And thinking about, what happens when the house is kind of already commodified, right? This is just a basic supply and demand curve. Q is quantity, P is price. And so, if the house is something that's delivered as an object, as a commodity, right, then what markets do is they kind of locate this equilibrium where supply meets demand, right? But even in the kind of this imagination of this, equilibrium, that's the kind of ideal market situation, we have this part of the demand curve that's left unsatisfied, right? And so usually, if you think about this as like, I want a large screen TV, but I'm only going to pay $100 for it, you don't get a large screen TV, okay, right? You'll move on with your life, right? But when that commodified object is a house, this area under the demand curve it's the homeless, it is sprawl, it is folks who are, living kind of, in situations that are not up to code, right? And so in that way, this is kind of already political, right? Whenever we accept the house as a kind of commodified object, it's already political. And that's where I want to think architecturally these questions of political ecology, white supremacy, the housing crisis and urbanism and gentrification at the scale of the building and sort of all at one time. And Detroit was really the place that has kind of taught me to do that. So I'm going to start this off with some research that I did around the water system in Detroit, because that photograph that I just showed, it was actually folks protesting evictions around water bills. And so I started mapping, trying to understand how is it that in the Great Lakes, like the largest freshwater system, there could be a mechanism where the house becomes this kind of eviction machine through water. And so what I'm mapping here is there are these combined sewer overflows, CSO events, and there's the suburban sprawl around Detroit that relies upon a centralized infrastructure. And in this way, water, when I started mapping it out, I started to understand that water and sewer lines and interceptors and this kind of regional distribution of clean water and more than clean water, sewage processing, it enables white flight similarly to highways, right? So we're kind of used to the story of the highway as this kind of mechanism for displacing Black neighborhoods and enabling white flight. But actually, the toilet and the sewer lines are doing this just as effectively. And so I'm always kind of bringing this back sort of to the house. This is just to show you Detroit's not empty. And I love that we were just talking about valves. These are these systems of valves distributed throughout the suburban network. There's kind of this constant measurement of something that really can't be measured. so then, as I'm mapping not just displacement, but actually these become brownfields, these sites of eviction then become kind of abandonment and vacancy, and these sort of physical houses are falling apart. Then I started to consider the physical house as this kind of eviction machine. And of course, to consider the house as a machine for crisis troubles the modernist Corbusier notion of the house as a machine for living. Right? And instead, in this analysis, the house can be also a machine for evicting, a machine for displacing, a machine for shaming, for criminalizing, and of course, a machine for profit. And so I'm problematizing renovation here, and I'll kind of come back to that, but I'm instead positing some kind of, it's towards an anti-racist architecture. That's the ambition. I can't in 10 minutes give you the answer, but these are some kind of alternatives that I'm going to show you how my own work is staged within reconstruction, reparations, and repair. So the reconstruction then, so let me just kind of, this is a project in Detroit it's kind of in process already with some developers that sort of used this work to get community buy-in and then kind of abandon the work, which is unfortunate, but it's just kind of developers at all scale can do that. But I want to kind of ask the question, sort of, what does it mean to renovate? Because the proposition that we kind of presented to this community called Fitzgerald in Detroit is that already we would deal with existing houses differently. We would sort of think through basements. So the question, what does it mean to renovate? What are the protocols of renovation, and how do postcards and pictures, these kind of images of housing, figure into these protocols? So I just want to talk about that as you're just looking at this simple drawing of a basement. But renovation of existing houses is significantly distinct from the process of constructing new houses, in that it bypasses many points of licensing, zoning review, and mandated inspections. For new construction, with the proliferation of building codes in the 20th century, to shift from construction site to house, right, where you know something's not just a construction site, oh, that's a house, I can live there. That's sort of modulated by reviews and standards, engineers, and safety boards. In contrast, the transfer of existing houses to new owners or renters entails no suite of bureaucratic processes comparable to building code. And this is, I'm sort of thinking this through sociological and historical texts from Du Bois' Philadelphia Negro, through Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor's book that is not yet out. But historically in Black neighborhoods in this country, that distinction between the construction of a new house and the repurposing of an existing house has been over and over again as sort of a mechanism for exploitation, whereby, for example, folks could be sold a house that has no fixtures in it, or that has, no plumbing in it. So this is very charged to then kind of, go back into, a neighborhood in a city like Detroit, where these systemic, sort of issues of water have become means for evicting residents through these overpriced water bills. And I haven't had time to explain that to you, but just the bottom line is the suburbs pay hardly anything and Detroit residents pay almost everything. To really stage how can we approach existing houses in a way that, is something more like a kit of parts, right? It's something that acknowledges the house as these kind of parts that can be repurposed, rather than this kind of organic kind of image of a house, or this kind of organic domestic space. And so part of the pretense was that we would sort of deliver these sort of design tools, these kind of quick design tools, along with these sort of surface and material catalogs. And as I told you, the developers just did something else. But this is a more recent project in Detroit where the city had more agency. And so there was a way to really develop with the community engagement a little bit more transparency about what would happen. This is a neighborhood on the east side of Detroit, which is really sort of, for a long time, was sort of famous with sociologists because it's the most extreme Gini coefficient in the whole country, which just means like income inequality. It's like going between two different countries when you cross this threshold here into the suburbs. But that first model, you're looking at Jefferson Avenue, which became the core sort of part of really imagining more development for the first time in decades in this neighborhood. And sort of throughout this neighborhood were these single-family houses. This is my concern, was sort of really understanding what I talked about earlier, is how this kind of municipal infrastructure distributes waste effectively from the suburban house to the Detroiter's house. That was a little bit too much for the city to take on, but what we could do was really look at how these sort of open spaces that emerged, where the vacancy over time had led to demolitions of these houses, charting that in a way that is not concerned with sort of parcel by parcel, these sort of obsolete property models, but instead is really looking at how existing houses are clustering together. We started to locate these kind of archipelagos of houses in the midst of what's effectively this broad swaths of public space. And so that became a strategy to think new development in this location, in this huge open site that had been sort of flattened in preparation for development in the early 2000s that didn't come. We then thought of kind of very conventional retail and housing and all of that, but sort of snuck in with way too much kind of parking, all this kind of very conventional, sort of really still in a way, it's this Detroit sort of patterns of the car have not yet been eroded. But we were able to then kind of like take these archipelagos and kind of then situate them into this new development. So that this kind of, the model of this excessive parking and retail could then sort of break apart the same way that these open sort of flat terrains of these vacant houses had been broken apart by these folks who just kind of hung on to the neighborhood. So I want to, this reparations, it was, I guess the main thing to say here, I went to Pittsburgh and staged the first of this series of workshops that I called This Is What We Will Build When We Get Our Reparations. And the main thing that I just want to locate here is that I think there's a way of, in the same way that there's an alternative to thinking about the house and the existing building as always needing to be renewed, I think there's a way in which we can engage the public more directly without always kind of like dumbing down the sort of design capacities. And so this was a charrette that really, and then I sort of remixed and sort of recollaged everything that sort of emerged from the charrette, but sort of kept the programs and the scale. And what I sort of gathered from the process was the extent to which thinking reparations, the scale of it, when you think about, sort of making whole the descendants of those, who were sort of illegally kidnapped and exploited in this country for generations. It's a lot. It's at the scale of really thinking through energy and ecology in the way that we've been talking. And I just want to situate, one project that I did for the Venice Architecture Biennale, the U.S. Pavilion. Within that context, this was for the Livernois Yard site in Mexican town. So the U.S. Pavilion in 2016 commissioned, architecture firms to think through different sites in Detroit. And this is not reparations in the same way I was just discussing, but thinking of international trade between Canada and the U.S. as somehow also making whole the workers who've been implicated in dealing with air pollution and dealing with these other systemic crises. So I just want to end with two sort of individual houses in this kind of notion of repair. And again, sort of come back to the thinking the house as something other than a consumer object. So, even when we're talking about consumer objects, we don't buy renovated phones, right? We don't buy renovated cars. So I want to think through, what does it mean to make something renovated or renew it? What do we expect to be repeated? This is a project in Southwest Detroit that is really thinking of a house as already a piece of infrastructure for an educational institution, a high school. So to make a house new, distinct from reusing it, is to presume a separation between its inside and outside, right, as in a gut renovation. or its structure and its parts, as in a kitchen renovation, a bathroom renovation. It also presumes somehow that this action has been done before. One doesn't novate a house, but renovate. It presumes a repetition in the making that leaves some trace of how the house, the place, might be made again. In the absence of drawings, because usually for renovation you don't even need drawings, right? The possibility of this trace presumes a legibility of both the separation of inside and outside, structure and parts, but also an organic adherence between the two in the form of character, type, or simply history. So this is like approaching a kind of standard Detroit existing house, but trying to think of it already as part of an institution, dealing with the kitchen, but not wanting to sort of make it as a renovated kitchen, but already a relationship to this kind of greenhouse space that's supporting local urban farmers. The house would be occupied by this owner who's an engineer, but already sort of part of it would become this sort of public space as well. So I want to end with the House Opera, which is one of my first projects I did in Detroit, and then just sort of like continue this kind of what maybe is a model of repair or something else that's distinct from renovation. And so there's a way in which renovation depends on this kind of imagines a wholeness implied by the possible separation of the nature of structure from mere details. I was quoting Frank Lloyd Wright, but I won't go there. So this higher ideal of unity can become not only a way of designing buildings, but a way of seeing buildings, right? As something imbued with spirit, capital S spirit, and completeness, and an expression of life, right? So that's the organicism that I'm trying to operate against. The renovated house has a past life, both in the sense of historical past and in the sense of a life imbued with spirit. And so basically, you know, what I'm trying to do with the House Opera, and what we worked on with folks in the neighborhood, was actually kind of deal with an existing house, but without this kind of baggage of domesticity, without this baggage of this kind of this life and the spirit of the house, but instead just make it this kind of just a place, a stage, a frame in which this kind of future and present cultural practices could happen. So hence the name House Opera. It's this kind of performance. And so in conclusion, and I'm thinking this through, again, Keonga Yamada Taylor's book that's coming out, that kind of engagement for me with sociology, it challenges architects to consider the politics of organicism, type and typology, and decoration also, as not only theoretical games, but tropes with real-life situated consequences and histories. For all of us interested in understanding society, including hopefully architects, then this urban crisis, right, housing crisis, these modes of crisis, you know, can be revealed to be not so much an era and a century as a suite of processes that define profit for some and exile for others, right? But I do think that we can hack these processes. So I leave you with this kind of mysterious image. All right, thank you.
Okay, so we're going to do a little bit of intra-group discussion here and then open it up to you at about 8:30. But I think, Mitch, your presentation at the end, thinking about the house itself was almost like an object for thinking with, a thing to scale different kind of political forms of consideration, is a nice way to, I'm hoping at least, a nice way to maybe make a transition between all of your projects. While you maybe started off by speaking at kind of the building scale or at thinking about the house as kind of the starting point, interscalar thinking was really a theme throughout all of the presentations. And if we think about the different words or synonyms for maintenance, maintenance is typically a term we apply to things like infrastructural scale systems. Repair is often applied to objects. Care is often something that has kind of an ethical or affective dimension that we typically think is happening on an interpersonal level. But all of you really talked about how these are really interwoven. And in order to do effective maintenance, you also have to think about caring for a community, for instance. So I'm wondering, even though it was a theme in each of your individual presentations, if after hearing everyone's, if maybe you'd like to say a bit more about the importance of thinking across these different scales. You're fixing objects, buildings, neighborhoods, and even big systems like racial capitalism, kind of by thinking across what's the value of having this interscalar thinking? That's maybe a huge question to start with, but we're being ambitious.
I'll take that on a little bit. You know, at the time that I was really working at the city scale, I was also on the co-op board and kind of trying to get everybody to work on our building. And I found it, really interesting to really look at the building in the context of what we were trying to do citywide. So I think really moving from scale to scale is a valuable thing. And then also looking at the city, and then we were trying to get some funding to look at STEAM, because it's become a little obsession. And we realized that none of the national labs even know that it exists, because all the national labs that deal with this stuff are all, on the West Coast, and they don't have it there, so it doesn't exist. And so we started to really look, and I started making calls and looking, on the internet, and I could see all the way out to North Dakota and down to Norfolk, you found STEAM contractors, advertising. So then you could start to see, well, actually this is a mega region. So, thinking from the building level to the mega region, has been interesting, and it's kind of important, because you need to, in order to see the picture, you have to see that it's not just a mega region. It turns out that most of Russia, most of Europe, actually Northern Europe anyway, has STEAM. So it's actually a global thing. So you got your work cut out for you. Better get busy.
I love the STEAM thing too. When I was teaching students at Michigan and citing studios in Detroit, I would try to share my obsession for district STEAM with the students and get them to really sort of research. But it's hard to kind of, if you have that, you either have that obsession or you don't. I think it's hard to transfer that one. But I think it's also very urban, right? Like at least district STEAM networks, or they're these kind of old downtown networks, and so they don't sprawl easily. Right? And that might be one reason that they're kind of erased as a kind of mode of infrastructure as well, right? Like this country loves to kind of reify modes of infrastructure that sprawl easily. But I think as far as this question of scale, I think that's, for me that's so core to the architectural discipline, is not so much like zooming in and out, but actually, working at specific scales, on specific things in specific ways, right? And I think it's one of the hardest things to teach when we're kind of starting always with 3D modeling, right? It's very much a kind of mode of drawing, right? To understand sort of line, weight, and scale together. And I say that as someone who never learned how to draw by hand architecturally. But in that way, I think sort of understanding sort of what's at stake at each scale is core to the discipline of architecture.
I'm not really a philosopher, so I don't think I have much to say on this.
Well, I would say you already did it. In your presentation, you talked about the individual and the holistic. So you had already addressed in your own practice how it's important to think across those different modes of practice.
Yes, it is.
Yes. So let's see how much time we have left here. Okay, so I think another question, a lot of you also talked about issues of late agency, or maybe we could also frame that as labor. So in a lot of new developments, for instance, I did a project on Hudson Yards a few years ago where the operative logic essentially is to hide maintenance as much as possible, to take all the trash away in pneumatic tubes, which is obviously not a new idea. But you talked about the community engagement in Pittsburgh, for instance. Jenny was talking about resident participation, community-based practices. So I'm wondering if you could say a bit about the division of labor for maintenance, about how maybe important it is to make certain things visible to communities so they're aware of the existence of these systems, the importance of maintaining them. So how we distribute labor, how we make things visible and invisible, and what the politics of those are.
I'll give you a very specific example of that. So in my giant 212-degree steam thing, a lot of people, because the super before me would just crank up the heat and walk away, so a lot of people didn't understand why they needed to cover their air conditioners and fought me on it when I lowered the steam. And so I have a little infrared thermometer like you use on a barbecue or something, and I would take it to their apartment and go, okay, so look, over here it's 60 degrees, that's why you're cold. You're getting heat, look at the radiator, it's 212 degrees. What's happening? Look at your air conditioner, it's minus 20. So it was really a practical way to show them that what was the question again?
It's making those systems visible in a way to
Yes,
encourage
making
people
it
to.
visible so they could see
Yeah.
right there what was actually happening.
Well, I think these policies which of making the energy use of these buildings visible through these labels are going to be, it's going to, or these grades are going to be a good thing, except that the way the grades have been structured, almost half the buildings are going to get Ds. So I think there's going to be a lot of, we had grade D.
No grade inflation?
We had grade deflation here. It's going to be quite a splash of cold water when those grades go up. But you know, I think everybody thinks that's going to be a big motivator, because who wants a D in the lobby of their building? So, yeah. So one of the things I've found about energy in buildings is that many people who aren't in the field, when I say I work on greenhouse gas emissions in buildings, they look at me blankly, and they say, yeah, it's the energy in buildings. And they say, buildings use energy? And I say, yeah, I mean, lights and your computers and the heating systems. And they go, oh, yeah. So, you know, it really is very invisible to most people. Certainly in cities where people like Jenny are handling things, so not single-family homeowners probably have a little more sense, but.
One more thing, also in our building, it's a shared water bill, so people have no idea how much water they're using. We get a gigantic bill once a month, and you know, it's 159 units. So that is another thing that is invisible.
I don't know, I'm sometimes skeptical. I feel like we have awareness fatigue, you know, on a lot of things. And another sociologist that I like to think with, Ruha Benjamin, she likes to say that the facts won't save us, you know, that there's a kind of something in fiction, and I think also in doing things, you know. I mean, I think the thermometer, in one level, it's not really so ocular. It's also kind of like you're kinetically moving through somebody's space and showing them that things change as you move, right? And there's a kind of power in that, I think.
Also, the responsibility then of them covering their air conditioner. So it goes like, just cover it. It's not a big deal.
So, I mean, I'll just give one anecdotal example. You probably know about Sidewalk Labs in Toronto. They themselves have recently released their own kind of emblems, their own grading system to essentially make apparent to people where sensors are in the environment. So they have a system kind of like, almost like a hazard symbol, essentially. Not really asking people, do you want to have your photo taken? Do you want to have data collected from you? It's like essentially transparency as this inherently good thing, without really asking the question of whether or not these infrastructures are an inherently good kind of common resource. But just making people, it's a fait accompli that they're going to be there, but awareness itself is supposedly kind of a political palliative for having a surveillance society. As long as you know the technology is there, that kind of is an offset for the potential deleterious effects of the technology. So that was a bit of a tangent.
Go to Twitter, you'll see more.
Let's see, what should we do with our last couple minutes here? So I guess we could, given that this is for the Architecture League, because I'm assuming a lot of architects in the room, what would it mean to design, I know you focused on renovation, reparations, but what would it mean to design a building from scratch with its eventual maintainability, with the needs of caregivers, of alternative forms of labor, of repair in mind? How might that change the standard practice or even the pedagogy of architecture if maintenance were integrated, repair and care were integrated from the get-go, essentially, in conceiving what a building is supposed to do? Or does it already do that?
No, I don't think we already do that. I mean, I think this is a really radical proposition of housing and education that you laid out. You know, this idea that there would be this kind of construction workforce trained in existing buildings, you know, not just kind of repairing, but also monitoring and analyzing, and that would be also a kind of mechanism of achieving housing. I think is actually really, really radical, both in the sense of like what housing does and also kind of pedagogy as well.
But what about you as a building superintendent? What would you, if you were able to kind of the primary consultant in designing a new building, if something was being designed from your perspective, how might that process change?
Interesting. I would have, so some of the things that are happening right now, it is in plumbing, they're changing things that you have to make sure you put in a plumbing system. So every shower body has to have check valves on it, so it can't go backwards and cross over and mess up how the system functions. But almost always all that stuff is hidden in the walls. So when it goes bad, you have to break open the walls. So if things could be designed with an access panel to the plumbing, for instance, so you don't have to constantly interrupt things in that way. So there are ways to get to what you need to do. That is one thing that occurs to me. Keeping plumbing away from outside walls is always a bonus. So it doesn't freeze, especially in colder areas. They're just like things that kind of, I'm sure most architects already think of, kind of no-brainers. But there would be things, like that would make a difference in maintenance.
I think that sounds like it makes a lot of sense.
But, there's some discussion about scaling that up to the urban scale as well, and how might you, for example, design transit system for repair and care, particularly for the labor of care, for people like hospice workers or home health aides, how they might need different infrastructural systems that work differently than those for the standard kind of radiating out from Manhattan version. How might we kind of take that mode of thinking and scale it down to the building and to these other scales of operation we've been talking about tonight? And maybe that's a transition into, I guess, maybe the last question I'll ask is, when is maintenance, and you've already touched on this, Mitch, when is it not the appropriate course of action? There's a heritage conservationist, Caitlin DeSilvey, who has this concept of curated decay. Essentially, when do you allow for the graceful degradation, the responsible kind of dissolution of something? Or one of the readings that's posted on the Architecture League's website, I doubt many of you have done homework for coming here tonight, but I encourage you to take a look at some of the text they posted there. Bradley Guy is proposing what he calls design for disassembly, which involves designing with an eye towards the eventual upcycling and recycling of materials from renovated or demolished buildings. So when is allowing decay or allowing dissolution or choosing not to maintain or renovate a more appropriate course of action than preserving?
Well, it might be, I mean, there are different conditions for different cities and localities in the country, and some places are growing and some places are shrinking. And so you might think of that as a strategy in an area with shrinking populations. And, there aren't, I'm sure many people are thinking about that, but what are the models then there? And that sounds like, I don't think in a place that's growing, that would make a lot of sense.
It sort of makes me think of your basement greenhouse ideas. Like, so if the population is going away and there are still these structures that are starting to crumble, if they were built in a way that would make them come apart easily, you could take those and move them to where the people are moving to and leave the foundations where the people who remain could use them for some other purpose, which I think is really interesting.
Okay, we have like 2 minutes here, so I'll ask another question. Just because in the larger discourse of maintenance studies, I guess you could call that, which a lot of academics and artists are engaged in, they tend to think of this rise of interest in maintenance as something that has been that has arisen in response to or in opposition to a fetishization of innovation, as I mentioned at the beginning. But where I think we've seen plenty of examples here, but maybe we could just round out with a couple more. But where can maintenance actually not be opposed to innovation, but be innovative in itself? For example, there are people who are talking about incorporating artificial intelligence into helping with like building maintenance systems, for instance. Or, yeah, I'd love to know what you think about that. So any other places where a responsible, measured innovation might be meaningfully integrated into maintenance?
I don't, it could help some. I don't, for me, so much of it is looking at one thing and how it affects something else, and I don't know if artificial intelligence would be able to take all the different systems into account to figure out what's actually going wrong. Probably someday. Probably someday, that's all that will be left is artificial intelligence. We won't even be here.
Just that this kind of thinking through the valve and I mean, I didn't know about these valves that actually sort of want to be accessible for these different reasons, so I keep learning things that are actually useful from you. But I'm very interested in sort of thinking valves with the computer as opposed to against the computer. There's there was a mode of computing in the first half of the century that was very analog, and it got kind of displaced into the kind of electronic binary computer that we know for reasons that had to do with calculating numbers very quickly, as opposed to other things that we now expect computation to do. So I think, I mean, even thinking about I'll just kind of leave it with that. This kind of intelligence of the valve and how it's accessed and how that might be computed, I think would propose a different model of computation and artificial intelligence entirely. That to me is more interesting.
Yeah. Well, even if you rethink the genealogy of computation, look at parts from the non-Western modes of the history of computation, you see a lot more interesting and diverse kind of mechanical systems and logistical systems that could be kind of useful metaphors for thinking about what intelligence means in kind of our contemporary context here. So we have some time left for questions from all of you out there. Just because this is being recorded and we'd like this to be accessible to everyone, we do have microphones at the two front aisles of the room if anybody would like to come up and ask a question to anyone.
Bueller? Anyone?
Hello, everyone. I really enjoyed all of the presentations, very thoughtful. And I have a question. In 1888, the New York City Department of Health mandated for the very first time that tenements had to have plumbing. And this is a signal event because it's one of the first times that we had really a building code that was enforced by the city. The story goes that the trustees of Trinity Church and other large landowners and landlords sued the city, and they said, no one's ever going to know how to use that stuff. I mean, they're immigrants, so we don't think we should have to put this in. But fortunately, they lost in court, and now we have to do that. We have to have, indoor plumbing. So I'm wondering, to what extent would civic mandates, laws, bear on the future of maintenance of existing buildings?
In some sense, New York has taken that on with the audit and retro-commissioning law, so that every 10 years these large buildings have to do that. They have to they have to upgrade their systems, and they have to make sure the systems are working well. That's what the retro-commissioning is. And there has been some talk in the energy world about maybe some modest requirements for maintenance of particular pieces of systems, but that's never gotten off the ground, but it has been discussed.
I will say that the city has been dumping a lot of local laws recently, and a lot of them have to do with maintenance or things that are part and parcel to maintenance. Like if someone is doing a renovation now in X size building, you have to have posted by the elevators that this is happening. Local Law 55, which deals with allergens and pests. There's a whole way that you have to deal with that now. You can't just, go, I sprayed a little bit, it's done. So there are all kinds of things that the city is doing now, and I can't remember all of them because there were so many of them. Like every month they drop 2 more, so it's all this like, what do I have to do now? But I think that sort of speaks to your question that the city really is doing a lot of things that have to do with maintenance and being pretty aggressive about it right now also. There is Local Law 11, which is on a 10-year cycle. There are a lot of different local laws that deal with stuff like that.
Yeah, yes, if I may, that is what I was sort of driving at. I mean, there seems to be an ever-increasing regulatory regime.
Yes, I
And,
agree with you.
And I mean, sure. I mean, it's obviously the intentions are the best, right? I mean, we want to get off fossil fuels and reduce energy use and bring down our carbon footprint and so on. And so that's great. But on a personal level, I was interested to hear your response.
It is a lot of work. I think most of it, like the pest and allergen stuff, we were already on board with that anyway. It's sort of figuring out the wording of how the city says things. That's the hard part, is like going, what are they actually trying to say? Are we doing that or not? So yeah, in most cases we are on board with all of it. It hasn't been too hard for us, but I know that there are other buildings that may not be in the same spot. And it's I think a housing justice issue for a lot of it. It's like a lot of housing isn't being taken care of well, and what neighborhoods is that in, and who's doing it or not doing it, and who's paying for it or not paying for it. It's a whole lot of stuff like that.
Anyone else?
Hi. You mentioned in regards to the steam, and I just wanted to know, a lot of evictions currently in New York are behind like mold evasions that's come up in the apartments. The correlation between the steam and the valves, do you find that that's like big within the mold and like removal of the mold within certain buildings? And within building maintenance? Is there like some type of cross paths?
I think you're asking if the steam can be causing the mold, is that?
Right, is there like?
It could be. If the steam's not maintained right and there are leaks,
Right.
That's water, and it's gonna, it could create a mold situation. It's
So-
not necessarily the same, but it could be.
So we had like possibly a valve that was computerized that identified like certain levels, like within like the moisture within the room, we can possibly reduce that whole possibly mold.
Yeah, I don't
No,
know what
they don't
that
talk
valve
about it.
would be. That's not something that I've used, so I'm sorry I can't answer that. I'm interested to find out what that is, though.
So I have a question for Jenny that I think also connects back to a few of Shannon's questions, which is, I was curious, once you've started implementing some of, in a way, the easy fixes to energy efficiency in the building, how the staff has responded, and curious maybe about the difference between, or if you see a difference between work that falls more under, I'm thinking specifically of things like having to clean out dryer ducts twice a year, and if there's a distinction between work that's seen more like, I think we sort of think of tinkering in a way as this, productive work of messing with things and fixing them and making them work better. When the work of cleaning, which is another part of maintenance, is something that most of us try to avoid. We want technology to help us not do it. When people are into it, we pathologize that, right? Like that's obsessive compulsive behavior to actually want to clean. So I'm curious in your experience if you see those two things as part and parcel, if there is a distinction that's worth making between the sort of maintenance of tinkering and the maintenance of cleaning, and maybe coming back there to where there's possibilities or desire for innovation that sort of saves us. Do we need to be saved from the cleaning, or are we debasing the cleaning? It's, a question / speculation.
Interesting. So cleaning the ductwork, for instance, we hire an outside company to do that. It's really, you have to have the right equipment, and it's not worth it for us to have the equipment to do that. That is definitely part of maintaining the dryers, though. If you live in a private home and you don't clean your ductwork, you can start a fire. So it's part of the safety part of what I was talking about, making a building, that part of safety maintenance that actually impacts the bottom line too, because the dryers do run more efficiently if the ductwork is clean. But the general cleaning of the building, so the staff that we have, and we have a small staff for the building being as large as we are. We have part-time doormen, we have a handyman and a porter, and me, and then there's one more guy who sort of helps with everything, but he is moving to North Carolina, and we might not be replacing him. Unfortunately, I'm not sure we could if we tried. But I do notice that, so the guy who's the porter does a great job. The staff actually really works well together, and they will jump in and help each other if it's needed. Kind of nobody likes to clean. I personally actually do like to clean. I'm a weirdo, whatever. But it does make a difference, and cleaning certain things is very important because it does make the habitability better. Like, you don't want diapers laying around in the basement that come down the chute for days at a time, because that's not sanitary, and it doesn't smell good, and nobody wants to be around it. I'm not sure that I answered your question, but yeah, it's just that kind of thing. Can cleaning be, I think part of the question was, can cleaning be automated or something? I don't know, cleaning is cleaning. I'm sure there would be some way to innovate it. I guess I'll have to think about it and see if there's any way to make it easier or...
But if you look at the history of cleaning, cleaning has always been innovated. I mean, there's always been innovation. We would outsource it to
Swiffers.
We would use Swiffers. Even the evolution of architecture, the moving of the cleaning staff off to kind of a separate wing of the building. We don't have to look at them if you have the means to build a house of significant size to do that.
Or something in architecture too, where they have just the vacuum things right in the floor, and you put a hose on it, and you don't have to drag the vacuum around. I mean, there are systems like that too that I've seen in bigger buildings.
And lots of great history about the grand domestic revolution, the assumption that has lasted for hundreds of years that new technologies will save us from the drudgery of housework. And all of this is wrapped up in racial and class distinctions also. Now, the fact that so much, if you have the means to outsource your cleaning, it's typically outsourced to the global care chain, essentially, people from the global south who are brought in to do the abject work that you don't want to do yourself. So just, again, thinking about the politics around a lot of these distinctions we make of what type of labor in this scale of care, repair, mending, cleaning, maintenance, etc., how they all have these different connotations to them that have a lot of politics attached to them. Any additional questions?
Hello. First of all, thank you very much. That was really interesting for me to see. I'm an SUE student, which is Sustainable Urban Environments, and I have a deep interest in something called green roofs. And so this is like for all of you, sorry, especially for you, Madame Kerr. But I was wondering if there's a space architecturally, knowing that cities need to renew themselves, right, for these for green roofs, I guess, and. In the case of the New York City green belt infrastructure, would this have any effect on the grading system, or is there space for policies to install them, I guess? Thank you.
We thought a lot about green roofs when we were doing Plan YC, and we thought the problem was really how do we combat the urban heat island effect the most effectively. So that was the problem we were trying to solve. And we looked at several techniques. One is cool roofs. One was street tree planting, and the other was green roofs. And as public policy, you want to solve the problem as cost effectively as possible, and cool roofs are very inexpensive and very effective. One thing that's really interesting about cool roofs that I just understood recently is that cool roofs, we know white reflects heat and so on, but one of the great things about cool roofs is that if the light is coming in and if it's not too, if there aren't too many clouds, that light, instead of turning into infrared heat and getting trapped in the atmosphere, it actually bounces right back out. So it's like, bye heat, one-way ticket out. And it's like very cool. I mean, so there are many ways that cool roofs work, but that's one that I hadn't understood, that it never actually turns into the infrared. It stays light and it goes out. So we found that from a public policy point of view, we could pass a cool roof ordinance, which we did do. So if you build a new flat roof, or if you are replacing a roof, it has to be cool coating. And the city did the Million Trees initiative. So because it felt that for many reasons the street trees were beneficial, but also for cooling the city. Green roofs are very expensive, and so I think from a policy point of view, it's much more conceived of as an amenity. And if people want to do it, it's an option rather than a cool roof, because it's a great thing, and it does a little bit more than cool roofs, but not that much. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Thank you.
I don't know if other people have thoughts on.
I tried to talk our building into it, and they didn't go for it.
I think maybe time for one more quick question.
One of you, before I forget who, mentioned public housing and how there's no heat this winter. And I was wondering if you could talk to whether the new laws that you were talking about will be applicable to public housing, and also for maintenance, like unless there's a really dedicated maintenance person in those buildings, which doesn't seem to be the case. How will they approach meeting those new laws, or just getting better and having heat in the winter?
I didn't really talk. I talked more about rent-regulated housing, which is there are all these different regimes in New York. Rent-regulated housing being rent-controlled or rent-stabilized, and actually it's a huge number of housing units. I think you're talking about NYCHA.
I was
probably.
thinking of NYCHA, yes, but I mean all city housing. Like, is that just because the buildings are so big, will they be affected by these new laws that you were discussing?
So NYCHA was actually exempted, in some sense, unfortunately, because these things are expensive, but they also benefit the building and benefit the residents. You fix the steam system, and then it's balanced, and you're not freezing or, So, and then the rent-regulated housing is held to a lower standard. Also beneficial in the short term in terms of costs, but not so great for those residents in the buildings in the long term because they won't run as well. So it was a politically determined. Also, yeah, I think it was primarily a political agreement in order to get the bigger law passed. So.
I also think, it's illegal to not have heat, of course. I don't know how you hold the city accountable for that. I also am not sure how you hold specific maintenance people accountable for not doing their jobs. I mean, that is part of their job. Part of it also is funding. So if you really want to do something and nobody's going to fund it, you can't do it. If you're the super and you're like, we need to fix this, and they're like, no, we're not giving you a new boiler. So what do you do? I don't know. I don't know how to address that.
I want to just clear up some misunderstandings. The city does not actually fund NYCHA that much. It's largely funded by the federal government, and the blame should be put on Congress. And Congress has consistently underfunded NYCHA. And
Isn't it also the cabinet, and that HUD is now being directed by a medical
absolutely.
doctor?
So it's the federal level is to blame largely for the problems at NYCHA, and the city keeps getting slammed for it, and you know, that's a little unfortunate. I'm sure the city has some mismanagement issues and this and that, but I think that it's been consistently 10% underfunding every year on every aspect of NYCHA. And, you know, ultimately, that's going to show. Yeah. So it's unfortunately a federal problem. And New York City has somehow managed to maintain this vast public housing. I think one out of, I'm going to be wrong here, but 1 out of 7 New Yorkers maybe lives in NYCHA housing. So it's huge, and it's maybe half the public housing in the whole country, because most other cities have not actually been able to even maintain the public housing. They've lost it one way or another. I'm not an expert in this. So New York has done a good job, at least, of keeping it, but with the chronic underfunding, you know, it's been a problem.
And if you want to read more about this, on the Architecture League's website, they reference a piece, an excerpt from, I'm going to get his name wrong, Nicholas Dagan Bloom's Public Housing Myths. So there's an excerpt published in, it's here too? He is here. Hello, Nicholas. Thank you for your work. Yeah. And there's also an excerpt on Urban Omnibus, which is, if you don't know, is the Architecture League's own publication. So thank you very much for joining us. And yeah, go out and maintain the world you live in, whatever means you have available. Thank you.